Nobody expected it to unfold like this. Not from T. For years, he carried a certain image in the public eye, controlled, strategic, always a step ahead. The type of figure who could sit in chaos and still make it look organized. But that image didn't just crack one day, it shattered in real time, in front of a camera, and then spread across the internet before anyone inside the room could even process what had happened. And at the center of it wasn't an enemy, a rival, or a public figure. It was his son, King Harris. The clip started like nothing, ordinary energy, a familiar family environment, no warning signs that anything was about to go wrong, but within seconds the tone shifted. Voices rose, movements became sharper, the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself, it just arrives. And then T moved. Not aggressively in the way people online immediately assumed, but decisively, like someone reacting to something only he fully understood in that moment. He stepped in and grabbed King, not as punishment, but as interruption, a stop signal, a forced pause in something that had already gone too far in his mind. That's the part the internet froze on, because people didn't see confusion on his face. They saw urgency. King, on the other hand, didn't back down. He resisted verbally, physically shifting away, still talking, still pushing the same energy he had before the confrontation started. And that contrast, father trying to stop, son refusing to slow down, is what made the clip spread so fast. But what nobody watching understood at the time was simple. This didn't start in that room. It started long before. According to people close to the situation, King had been moving differently for a while. Not suddenly, gradually. Livestream behavior becoming more unpredictable. Online moments turning into real-world tension. The line between performance and consequence slowly disappearing. And T had been watching all of it. Quietly at first. Then directly. Then urgently. Attempts were made behind the scenes. Conversations, warnings, guidance, even discipline that never made it to the public, but none of it held, not because no one tried, but because the energy King was chasing wasn't approval anymore. It was attention. And attention, good or bad, doesn't stop easily. That night, something crossed a threshold. On camera, you can feel the moment it changes. The shift is subtle but undeniable. The kind of shift where a situation stops being an argument and starts becoming something else entirely. King's response in that moment, refusal, defiance, dismissal, is what triggered the full break in tone. Because T wasn't reacting like someone trying to win a disagreement. He was reacting like someone trying to prevent escalation. And somewhere in the background, a voice cuts through the noise. King, you don't know what you've done. That line didn't belong to anger. It belonged to warning. And that's when the entire narrative changed, even for people who weren't in the room. Because suddenly, the question wasn't about behavior anymore. It was about consequence. What did he actually do before this moment? Who was involved? And why did everyone inside that space seem to understand something the camera didn't capture? Reports and online discussion began pointing to the same idea, that whatever triggered T's reaction wasn't just disrespect or internet behavior. It was something that had external weight, something that extended beyond the family dynamic, something that had already been noticed by others. King, however, didn't seem to process that in real time. He continued pushing the same stance, dismissive, unconvinced, almost treating the moment like another escalation that would eventually pass. But T didn't move the same way. His energy changed completely. Not louder, lower, heavier, controlled. The kind of control that comes when emotion is no longer the priority, containment is. You don't understand who you're dealing with, he says in a tone that doesn't carry performance, only intent. That distinction is what people missed. because this wasn't about discipline anymore. It was about exposure to something King wasn't aware of yet. And that's when the atmosphere inside the house shifted as well. Family members reportedly felt it before anything else was said. The energy wasn't normal argument energy, it was alert energy. Phones started moving. Conversations broke into urgency. People stopped reacting and started processing. And King, still in the middle of it, still didn't fully understand. To him, it was another heated moment. To everyone else reacting around him, it was already something bigger. Then came the escalation outside the visible moment. Messages, alerts, sudden reactions from people not physically present in the room. The kind of shift where a private situation starts bleeding into outside awareness. That's when panic starts forming. Not loud panic, quiet panic. The kind that changes tone. Instead of volume. Tiny Harris, according to reactions circulating afterward, was visibly shaken. Others in the family began reacting differently, not to what was being said in the room, but to what was being communicated outside of it. Because something had already moved beyond verbal conflict. And once that happens, control becomes secondary. Containment becomes everything. King, still inside the situation, begins to slow down emotionally, but not because he understands fully, more because the environment forces it. The reactions around him no longer match his perception of the moment. That mismatch is what creates confusion. And confusion is what replaces confidence. T, meanwhile, transitions completely into a different mindset. No longer arguing, no longer reacting emotionally, just calculating. Every movement becomes deliberate. Every word becomes measured. This is where viewers online started splitting interpretations. Some saw discipline, others saw fear, others saw something they couldn't fully define but could feel. Because the energy was no longer personal. It felt structural, like something external had entered the equation. And that's when another layer begins to surface. Mentions of earlier livestream behavior, online exchanges, and a specific moment where King had reportedly engaged with someone he shouldn't have engaged with in that tone. A moment that at the time looked like typical internet back and forth, but now gets reinterpreted entirely. Because context changes everything. The same words that once looked like noise start looking like triggers. The same reactions that seemed harmless start appearing connected. And that's how the narrative shifts, not through one event, but through reinterpretation of multiple events under pressure. As tension builds, the situation inside the house reportedly becomes controlled chaos, not explosive, contained. Security movement adjusts. Conversations drop in volume. People begin reacting to information not fully shown on camera. And King, for the first time, starts asking questions instead of making statements. What did I do? Not once. Repeatedly. Because the shift around him no longer matches his understanding of the situation. And that gap is where realization starts forming. Slowly, uncomfortably, but not fully yet. T eventually separates himself from the immediate space, not in retreat, in preparation. The kind of movement that signals decision-making is happening elsewhere. Inside that isolation, whatever he processes changes the direction of everything that follows. When he returns, the tone is different. Not emotional, final, and the message to King is simple but heavy. You're going to understand what this actually was. No further explanation in that moment. No resolution. Just transition. Because whatever this situation had become, it was no longer about explaining it inside the house. It had already moved beyond that. And outside, the internet had already done what it always does. It filled in the silence with theories, fear, and fragmented truths stitched together from clips and assumptions. But inside the Harris household, the reality was still unfolding. And whatever had been set in motion that night wasn't slowing down yet. It looked like a breakdown in real time. It started inside a normal family setting, nothing visually dramatic at first glance. No warning music, no obvious tension cues, just movement, conversation, and the kind of casual energy that usually gets ignored online. But then the tone shifted. Not instantly, gradually. A change in body language first, then voice tone, then distance between people, the kind of subtle buildup most viewers only recognize in hindsight. And then T moved into frame. The internet would later replay this moment endlessly, trying to decode it second by second. But in real time, it wasn't clear what was happening yet. What stood out wasn't violence or chaos, it was urgency. He wasn't performing. He was interrupting. And the person he interrupted was his son, King Harris. King didn't stop immediately. He kept talking, still locked into whatever mindset he was in before the moment escalated. That contrast, one person trying to pause the situation, the other refusing to exit it, is what created the first visible crack in the energy. But what people missed watching the clip for the first time is that this wasn't the beginning of the situation. It was the end of something already in motion. According to people close to the family circle, King's behavior had been shifting for a while, not in one dramatic moment, but in patterns. Online presence becoming more unpredictable, livestream energy becoming more confrontational, small moments that individually looked like internet personality behavior. But together, they formed something else. A trajectory. And T had been aware of it long before this night. Behind the scenes, there were attempts to correct it, conversations that didn't awe. Each social media, private warnings, attempts at redirection, even firm discipline that never became public narrative. But none of it fully changed direction. Because King wasn't just reacting to attention. He was adapting to it. And that kind of mindset doesn't respond easily to correction. That night, everything reached a point where correction was no longer enough. It had to stop. On camera, the turning point is subtle but irreversible. King's response, dismissive, unfiltered, emotionally locked into his own perspective, collided directly with T's shift in tone. And that's when everything changed. Because T didn't escalate emotionally. He escalated structurally. His body language tightened. His movement became precise. His tone dropped instead of rising. That shift is important because it signals something most viewers didn't immediately recognize. This was no longer a father-son argument. This was containment. And then in the background, a voice cuts through. Low, sharp, uncertain but intentional. King, you don't understand what you've done. That line spread faster than the clip itself. Because it introduced ambiguity. And ambiguity creates obsession online. Now the situation wasn't just about behavior. It was about consequences that weren't visible yet. What had actually happened before this moment? Who was involved? Why did the energy inside the room feel like everyone understood something the camera didn't fully capture? As the clip circulated, reactions began splitting in different directions. Some viewers saw discipline, others saw fear, others saw something they couldn't label but instinctively didn't dismiss. Because T didn't look angry in the traditional sense. He looked alert. And that difference matters more than people realize. Alertness implies awareness of something external, not just internal conflict. King, meanwhile, remained in a mindset that hadn't caught up with the shift. He continued responding as if the situation was still within familiar boundaries, arguments, ego, resistance, defiance. But the environment around him, was no longer matching that interpretation. That mismatch is where confusion begins. And confusion is the first stage of realization. As the situation continued, reactions inside the house reportedly changed faster than words could explain. Phone activity increased. Conversations broke apart into fragments. People stopped addressing each other directly and started reacting to information coming from outside the room. Not everything was spoken out loud. Some of it was understood silently. That silence is what makes the moment heavier than what's visible in the clip. Because once a situation starts extending beyond the physical space it happens in, control shifts. Not dramatically, but permanently. At some point, T steps away from the immediate confrontation space. Not in retreat, but in separation. A move that signals internal processing, decision formation, and something being resolved away from public view. When he returns, the tone is different again. Not louder, not emotional, final. And what he communicates to King is no longer reactive. It's directional. This is where King's confusion becomes visible even through fragments of footage. The shift in his behavior is no longer defiance, it's processing. Like someone realizing the context they were operating in was incomplete. That realization doesn't come fully at once. It arrives in layers, and every layer removes certainty. Outside the house, the internet continues to expand the narrative in real time. Clips are slowed down, audio is isolated, theories form faster than verified information. Every pause in official clarity becomes fuel for interpretation. But inside the situation, nothing is being interpreted anymore. It is being handled. And that distinction is where the story changes tone completely. Because at a certain point, this is no longer about a viral clip. It becomes about consequences that extend beyond the frame. And what King said, and more importantly, who he said it to, becomes less important than what it triggered. Because in situations like this, the visible moment is never the full event. It's just the part the camera caught before everything moved somewhere else. And what moved that night had already been in motion long before anyone pressed record. The problem with stories like this is that the internet only ever sees the surface first. A clip, a reaction, a moment that looks complete on its own. But what happened that night with T and King Harris didn't start as a moment. It unfolded like a chain reaction that nobody in the room fully recognized until it was already too late to stop cleanly. And even that is only part of it. Because when the footage began circulating, the public saw something simple at first glance: a father stepping in, a son resisting, voices rising, tension building. The kind of family conflict that usually gets labeled and forgotten within hours online. But this one didn't fade. It expanded, not because of what was visible, but because of what followed it. Inside the house, the shift didn't feel cinematic. There was no dramatic pause, no clear turning point where everyone suddenly understood the situation. Instead, it happened in fragments, changes in tone, sudden silence between sentences, people starting to react to things that weren't being said out loud. That's usually how serious situations begin internally, not with chaos, but with information imbalance. Some people know more than others. Some people understand the weight of what's happening before others even realize something has changed. And in this case, T was clearly not reacting in real time the way everyone else was. He was ahead of it. King, on the other hand, was still inside his own frame of reference, the same mental space he had been operating in before the confrontation started. For him, it still felt like escalation of an argument, something emotional, something temporary, something that would eventually settle once voices cooled down. But that interpretation started breaking apart quickly. because the responses around him didn't match that expectation. People weren't just reacting to what he said or did in that moment. They were reacting to something that had already been communicated outside of it. Phones were moving more frequently. Conversations were shortening. People weren't finishing thoughts fully. That kind of behavior usually signals one thing: external information is being processed while internal communication is still happening. And that creates tension without explanation. At a certain point, T's entire posture changes again, not visibly aggressive, not emotionally reactive, but structured. The kind of shift where someone stops participating in the situation and starts managing its direction. That's when people online later started describing him as different in that clip. Not angry, not confused, focused in a way that didn't match the surface-level conflict. And focus like that usually means one thing: the situation is no longer being evaluated emotionally. It is being evaluated for outcome control. King's energy, meanwhile, begins to fracture. At first, he still holds onto defiance, the same verbal resistance, the same dismissive tone, but over time, that starts to break down, not because someone directly shuts him down, but because the environment stops validating his interpretation of it. That mismatch creates cognitive friction. You can see it in the way people pause mid-response, when they realize their words aren't landing the same way anymore. At some point, there's a moment where communication stops being symmetrical. One side is responding to emotion. The other is responding to implication. And implication always outweighs emotion in high-pressure situations. That's when T separates himself briefly from the main space. Not as an exit, but as recalibration. And whatever happens during that separation is never fully shown on camera, but the result of it is visible when he returns. The tone is gone. Not gone as in absent, gone as in replaced. What comes back isn't frustration, it isn't argument, it isn't correction. It's finality. And that is the part people misread the most when they watch the clip without context. Because finality doesn't raise its voice. It lowers everything else around it. King's response starts changing after that point, not immediately into understanding, but into uncertainty. The same confidence that carried him through earlier parts of the interaction starts dissolving in real time, not because of what is being said directly, but because of what is no longer being said. Silence becomes more informative than dialogue. And that's where realization starts forming in fragments. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough to shift behavior. Outside the house, the situation no longer belongs to just the people inside it. Information begins leaking outward, not officially, not clearly, but through fragments, reactions, partial clips, and interpretations. And that's where the internet does what it always does best. It fills gaps with narrative. People start reconstructing timelines. They start isolating audio. They start connecting unrelated past moments to current behavior. Every small detail becomes a potential clue, even when it is. But inside the house, none of that reconstruction exists. There is only the present. And the present is unstable. At some point, someone in the environment reacts to information that isn't fully visible to the viewer. That's the moment where the situation stops being contained within the frame of the clip entirely. Because now there is external input affecting internal behavior. And once that happens, the original conflict becomes secondary. The system around it becomes primary. King, in this phase, starts asking questions instead of making statements. Not because he suddenly understands everything, but because his previous assumptions no longer hold up against the reactions around him. That shift is important, because confidence doesn't usually disappear in confrontation. It disappears when context changes faster than understanding. T's communication becomes minimal, not because he has less to say, but because saying more would no longer change direction. At that stage, instructions replace explanations. And instructions don't require agreement. They require compliance. As the situation continues to unfold, the energy inside the house becomes less about argument and more about stabilization. People are no longer trying to win anything. They are trying to understand scope. Because something about the situation feels larger than the interaction itself. That feeling, when a moment stops feeling isolated and starts feeling connected to something outside of it, is usually what triggers fear in environments like this. Not what is happening, but what it might be connected to. And that is where the narrative starts splitting again. Because online, people are still treating it like a single incident. But inside the situation, it is already being treated like a chain. A sequence. Something that didn't begin here and will not end here either. And once that realization settles in, everything that follows changes tone completely. Not louder, not more chaotic, more controlled, more cautious. Because at that point, the goal is no longer resolution. It is direction management. And whatever direction this was heading toward was already beyond the moment the camera first started recording. The next part of the situation doesn't unfold like a typical escalation. There is no sudden explosion, no clear turning point where everyone agrees the danger has arrived. Instead, it shifts into something far more uncomfortable: anticipation. That feeling when everyone in a space is reacting to something that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. Inside the house, conversations begin to break into fragments again. Not full discussions, not arguments, just short exchanges that end too quickly, like nobody wants to be the one holding the sentence when something new arrives. Phones are no longer just tools, they become warning systems. Every vibration changes body language. Every notification pauses movement. And every glance at a screen adds a new layer of tension that doesn't need explanation. King is still trying to process everything, but the key difference now is that his questions are no longer being answered with emotion. They are being answered with restraint. And restraint is always more unsettling than anger. Because anger at least confirms engagement. Restraint confirms control. At some point, T steps into a space alone again, not publicly acknowledged in detail, not dramatized in the moment, but clearly separate from the ongoing noise. The shift is noticeable even without words, when someone who has been actively present stops reacting to the environment and starts operating outside of it. That's usually when decisions are being made that don't require input from the immediate room. And when he returns, the energy has changed again. Not visibly dramatic, structurally different. The kind of change you don't immediately identify, but you feel in how people respond to him. Less interruption, less overlap in speech, more waiting before speaking. That subtle hierarchy shift that happens when the situation stops being conversational and becomes directional. King notices it too, but not fully in terms of understanding, more in terms of absence. The absence of the version of the situation he thought he was still inside. Because what he is experiencing internally is lag. His interpretation is running behind the environment. And that gap keeps widening. Outside the immediate setting, the internet continues building its own version of events in real time. Clips are still circulating, but now they are being recontextualized. What originally looked like a family confrontation is being reframed as something with external pressure attached to it. And that reframing changes audience perception. People stop asking, "What happened in that moment?" and start asking, "What happened before it?" That's where speculation intensifies. because the past becomes more important than the present. And the less official clarity exists, the more imagination fills the space. Inside the house, however, imagination is not part of the environment anymore. Everything is grounded in immediate awareness. At one point, a new piece of information enters the space indirectly, not through explanation, but through reaction. Someone receives something on their phone, and their entire posture changes before they even speak. That reaction alone becomes enough for others to understand the weight of it. No one asks immediately what it is, because asking feels like it might confirm something they are not ready to confirm. Instead, there is a pause, a collective hesitation that stretches longer than words would. And that silence becomes its own form of communication. T observes it without reacting loudly. That is important because it signals that he is no longer gathering emotional input from the room. He is gathering structural input, understanding who reacts how and when. King, meanwhile, is no longer in a defensive posture. He is in an observational one, trying to map meaning from reactions instead of statements. That is usually the point where the internal narrative starts collapsing, when someone realizes they are no longer receiving complete information, only responses shaped by information they do not yet have. At some point, King finally speaks again, but the tone is different. Not confident, not dismissive, more uncertain, like he is trying to anchor himself back into a version of the situation that no longer exists. But nobody around him confirms that version anymore. And that is what makes it worse. Because when your internal understanding stops matching external reality, you don't know whether to trust your interpretation or your environment. And in situations like this, environment always wins. Eventually, T communicates again, not as escalation but as instruction. Short, controlled, deliberate. The kind of communication that removes ambiguity instead of adding to it. And that signals a shift in priority. The situation is no longer being managed socially. It is being managed operationally. At this stage, even silence has structure. Movement becomes intentional. Positioning becomes calculated. People are no longer reacting freely. They are adjusting to an unspoken framework that is now guiding everything. King begins to understand fragments of it, but understanding fragments is not the same as understanding the full picture. And that partial awareness creates its own kind of anxiety, because you know something is happening, but not enough to predict it. And unpredictability is the most destabilizing part of any escalating situation. Outside, the audience continues to grow. New viewers enter the story midway, trying to catch up. Old viewers rewatch earlier clips with new assumptions. Every angle is being analyzed, slowed, dissected. But none of that analysis can access what is happening in real time inside the house. Because inside, the situation is no longer about the original incident. It is about what that incident activated. And that is where the direction of everything begins to shift again. Not toward resolution, not toward closure, but toward exposure. Because once external pressure becomes part of an internal situation, it stops being contained within personal conflict. It becomes something that demands response beyond the moment. And whatever was set in motion that night was no longer dependent on understanding alone. It was already moving on its own.